Jack Rourke thought buying a rundown 50s diner for $100 was just a desperate man's gamble. But when his old German Shepherd Max began scratching under the counter, they uncovered something no one expected. If that hook caught your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true soul stories. Jack Rourke hadn't planned on stopping in Redfield, Montana. The town wasn't on any map he'd meant to follow, just one of those places you pass through on the way to somewhere better. But when his truck coughed and gave out near the edge of Main Street and he saw the hand-painted sign, Maggie's Place, closed. Since 1974, something in him stilled. Maybe it was the name. Maybe it was the way the diner leaned into the wind like an old soldier refusing to fall. He sat behind the wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled Max's head resting on his thigh. The German Shepherd's fur was graying at the muzzle now, just like Jack's temples. They'd both seen too much 2 tours overseas, a wife's slow passing the echo of a home that didn't exist anymore. "What do you think, partner?" he muttered, scratching behind Max's ear. The dog gave a low grunt, the kind that meant do what you have to. By sunset, Jack was standing in front of the place with the county auction agent. $100, the man said, voice flat as the sky. "It's condemned on paper, but you can sign a liability waiver and take ownership." Jack almost laughed. "You're telling me I can buy a diner for less than a night in a motel?" The man shrugged. "That's about what it's worth." There was a pause long enough for wind to whistle through the cracked windows. "But you might want to read the fine print." He tapped a yellowed clause at the bottom of the deed. The counter must remain intact. Any alterations void the sale. Jack frowned. "What's that about?" "No idea," the man said. "Been in the contract since the 60s. Jack signed anyway. He wasn't looking for sense, just distraction. When he opened the front door, the smell of old grease and coffee ghosts hit him thick and familiar. The place looked frozen mid-lifetime stools, lined up like soldiers waiting for orders menus, still taped behind cracked glass, a jukebox slumped in the corner. He ran his hand across the counter. It was smooth cool, under layers of dust, the kind of formica they didn't make anymore. Max patted in behind him, nose, twitching claws, clicking softly. The sound echoed through the empty diner like footsteps of something that had never quite left. That first night, Jack set up a cot in the corner booth. He heated a can of soup on a camping stove and watched the last light bleed through the blinds. Max lay near the counter, head between his paws, staring into the dim space beneath it. Around midnight, Jack woke to the sound of barking, deep, sharp, urgent. Max was on his feet, teeth bared, tail stiff, facing the counter like it had moved. "Easy," Jack said, grabbing the flashlight. "What is it?" He knelt down, shined to the beam underneath. The wood beneath the counter looked ordinary, at first scuffed, grimy, but then he heard it a hollow thud when he knocked. He rapped again. The sound came back different, metallic, buried. Max whined, pacing tight circles, ears forward. "You're hearing things," Jack muttered, though his voice didn't sound convincing even to himself. He leaned his back against the counter, staring at the peeling paint on the far wall. What the hell had he just bought? Outside wind rattled the loose sign, making it sound like someone whispering, "Don't." Max settled again, but kept his eyes fixed on the same spot. Jack reached down, ran a hand through the dog's fur, feeling the warmth against his cold palm. "Relax, buddy. It's just a floor." But as he looked at the outline where the wood met tile, he saw faint rust stains spreading outward like something had once leaked up from beneath instead of down. The hair on his arms stood up. He turned off the flashlight, told himself he was imagining it, and lay back on the cot. Sleep didn't come easy. It hadn't in years. Every time he drifted a memory, weighted sandstorms, rotors, chopping air, the sound of his wife coughing in the dark. When dawn finally scraped across the horizon, he got up, stretched the stiffness from his joints, and looked around at the diner again. The light made it almost beautiful, dust glowing like gold in the air, the counter shining faintly. "Guess it's you and me, Max," he said. The dog wagged once, slow, solemn. He didn't yet know that beneath the counter lay a story tied to his own bloodline, waiting for someone who still knew how to listen to ghosts. For the first time in years, something in him felt awake. He picked up a wrench, rolled up his sleeves, and said to Max, "Let's see what $100 bought us." By the third morning, the wind had picked up over Redfield, rattling the diner's windows like a warning Jack refused to hear. He'd spent 2 days scrubbing grease from the walls and fixing leaky pipes, trying to make sense of the place he'd just bought, but the sound from under the counter still lived in his head. Every time he walked past that section of floor, he could hear it, the faint echo-metallic hollow patient. Max never stopped watching it either. He'd sit by the counter for hours, tail still ears up, eyes following something only he could sense. Finally, Jack gave in. "All right," he muttered, setting down his coffee mug. "Let's see what's hiding down there." He pried at the warped floorboards with an old screwdriver until one gave way with a sharp crack. Dust billowed up, coating the air like ash. Underneath, his flashlight caught a dull glint of tin. He brushed at it with his sleeve, revealing the corner of a small box, rusted greasy, the kind used for storing tools or rations decades ago. It was wedged tight between joists as if someone had gone out of their way to hide it. Jack pulled it free and set it on the counter. Max stepped closer, nose twitching, giving a low whine that made Jack pause. "Yeah, I smell it too. Oil-old paper, maybe trouble." The box's hinges protested as he forced it open. Inside wasn't what he expected. No cash, no ledgers, just a cloth-wrapped bundle soft with age. He unrolled it carefully. Out slid a small notebook, its cover stained dark from years of grease and a faded black-and-white photograph. A young woman smiled at the camera, hair tucked under a bandana, arms wrapped around a German Shepherd puppy. The handwriting beneath the photo was delicate but steady for Ed. For coming home. Jack stared at the words until they blurred. For a second, he thought of his own wife, Sarah, and how she used to leave notes in his rucksack before deployments, tiny scraps of paper with words like, "Come back to me." He blinked, grounding himself in the present. This woman had lived decades before him. Still, there was something haunting in the way she smiled, as if she knew what waiting felt like. He flipped the photo over. Faded blue ink spelled out a name and a date, Margaret Rourke, 1954. The name hit him harder than he wanted to admit. Rourke, his name. He leaned back on the stool, the air thickening around him. "That's not possible," he whispered. He'd grown up thinking the Rourkes started with his father. There were no stories of any Margaret, no mentions of Montana, no connection to a diner called Maggie's Place. But here she was, her name, written in a hand that trembled slightly, like someone who'd written in a hurry or with emotion too heavy to control. Jack ran his thumb over the edge of the notebook. Inside, the pages were filled with recipes written in the same looping script. Beef stew, apple pie, cornbread, all measured in pinches and handfuls instead of cups and ounces. Old-style recipes, the kind that came from memory, not measurements. But some pages held notes that didn't fit. Phrases like, "For the boys coming home," and "Remember to serve the stew with cinnamon makes it feel like Sunday." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. The thought of someone decades ago writing comfort like a mission made something in him ache. Max let out a low growl, not angry, more like warning. His gaze was locked on the open floor where the box had been. Jack followed his eyes, shining the flashlight into the gap. The beam caught something else. Another sliver of metal, deeper down, maybe another layer, maybe just pipework. He hesitated. "We'll get to that," he murmured, setting the notebook aside. He looked at the photo again. Margaret Rourke. Maggie. He turned to the faded sign outside the diner window, Maggie's Place, and felt the first cold thread of connection tighten in his chest. He picked up the notebook, flipping through until a recipe caught his eye. Homecoming stew. He said the name out loud. It sounded familiar, though he couldn't place it. The ingredients were simple, but the margin note beside it was strange for Ed. For those who never came home. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that line. The photograph lay on the counter beside the open tin box, catching the pale winter light. Max came to sit next to him, resting his chin on Jack's knee, eyes lifting to the picture as if recognizing the breed in the woman's arms. Jack scratched the dog's head absently. "She even had one of you," he said softly. "Guess shepherds ran in this story long before we showed up." He looked again at the date 1954 and did the math. That was nearly 70 years ago. If she'd been in her 20s, then she'd be long gone now, and yet her handwriting, her recipes, her words, they'd outlived her. He slid the notebook into his jacket pocket, feeling its warmth against his chest. "Maggie Rourke," he murmured. "Who were you?" Outside wind scraped the old sign again, the faint creak sounding almost like a sigh. Jack turned off the flashlight, leaving the counter in shadow. The tin box sat open between them, silent, waiting. Something in the diner had shifted barely, but enough for him to feel it. Like the place was breathing again. Max lifted his head, ears pricked, and Jack found himself listening too. Not to the wind this time, but to the quiet hum beneath the floorboards, steady as a heartbeat, as if the diner itself was remembering. The next morning, the sky hung low over Redfield, washed in the pale gray of late autumn. Jack loaded Max into the truck and drove down the main street, passing shuttered storefronts and faded flags drooping from old poles. The diner had left him with more questions than answers, and the only place in town that might still keep answers was the library. A squat red brick building that looked like it had been standing since before the war. Inside it smelled like paper dust and time itself. The woman at the front desk glanced up as Jack approached. She was thin and white-haired, glasses hanging low on her nose, her cardigan the color of faded lilac. Her name tag said Ellen. "Morning," Jack said, setting the tin box and the photo on the counter. "I'm looking for information about a woman named Margaret Rourke. Maggie, maybe. She ran a diner in town years ago." Ellen's expression softened, surprise flickering across her face. "Maggie Rourke," she repeated quietly. "Goodness, that name hasn't been said in a long time." She peered at the photograph, her hand trembling a little as she lifted it closer to the light. "Yes, that's her. And that looks like the old shepherd she had, Buddy. I used to see them through the diner window when I was a little girl. She'd let me come in sometimes to stir the stew." Jack felt something shift inside him. So she was real. Real, Ellen smiled faintly. "More real than most people I've known. She used to feed every veteran who came through after the Korean War. Wouldn't take a dime. Said feeding them was her way of keeping her husband's promise." Her husband Jack leaned in. "Do you know his name?" Ed Ellen said softly. "Edward Rourke. He came back from the war, broken, they said. But Maggie, she believed in him. They ran that diner together for a few years, then..." She stopped, glancing around as if the walls might be listening. "Then she died. Right there at the counter." Jack's throat tightened. "What happened?" Ellen's eyes dimmed with memory. "They said she was making her homecoming stew, the special she always made on Fridays. She collapsed while stirring the pot. Heart stopped. Some say it was exhaustion, others say it was sorrow. She'd been losing sleep worrying over her husband. They say he was the only one there when it happened." She lowered her voice. "He left town that same night, never came back." He could almost see her hair tied back, apron dusted with flour, stirring stew, humming softly before she fell. The image unsettled him, too vivid for something that had happened 70 years ago. "You wouldn't happen to have any records?" he asked. Ellen nodded slowly. "Old papers are in the archive room. Far back, third shelf. Look under 1954 to 1960. She paused before he turned to leave. "You know," she said, "people around here used to say Maggie's diner had a soul, that she poured love into every bowl. After she died, no one could eat there without feeling different. Like she was still watching, making sure no one left hungry." Jack forced a small smile. "I believe it." In the archive room, the lights flickered weakly overhead. Boxes of newspapers stacked high, brittle pages yellowed and curling. He found the edition dated November 2nd, 1956. The headline read, "Local Woman Dies Serving Veterans." The story beneath was brief. Margaret Rourke, owner of Maggie's Place, collapsed behind the counter during her final shift. Doctors cite sudden heart failure. She was 29. Jack read the words, twice a strange ache tightening behind his ribs. She'd been younger than he'd imagined. A lifetime folded into one sentence. But then, in smaller print near the bottom of the column, another line caught his eye, witnessed by husband Edward Rourke, who departed town later that night in a military supply truck. The article ended there. No funeral notice, no follow-up, just silence. Jack leaned back against the shelf, the paper trembling in his hand. He left her, he said under his breath. He watched her die, and he left. Max, who had been sitting by the door, tilted his head at the tone in Jack's voice. Jack crouched beside the dog, pressing his forehead briefly to Max's. She died, making that stew, he whispered, and he just drove away. The thought lodged in him like shrapnel. He folded the paper carefully, took a photo of the article with his phone, and slid it back into the box. As he walked out, Ellen was waiting by the desk. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I'm not sure," he said honestly, "but I think I found the reason this place feels the way it does." Ellen nodded slowly. "Some stories stick to the walls," she said. "Maggie's is one of them. After 1956, townsfolk and veterans kept the Friday stew tradition running on rotation until 1974, when the place finally closed its doors. Outside, the air had turned cold enough to see his breath. Jack climbed into the truck and sat there for a long moment, the engine idling. The newspaper image replayed in his mind: the diner, the counter, the woman who died trying to keep a promise. He looked down at the notebook on the seat beside him. The word "homecoming" stared back at him in faded ink. Max pressed his nose against Jack's arm, a low whine rising in his throat as if urging him to go back. Jack started the truck, turned down Main Street, and watched the diner appear in the distance through the thin veil of fog, its sign creaking softly in the wind as if whispering her name. By the time Jack pulled back into the gravel lot of Maggie's place, the sun had sunk low behind the ridge, staining the sky a rusted orange. The diner stood quiet against the wind, the windows dim with age, yet something about it felt less empty than before. He carried the old recipe notebook under his arm, its pages fluttering faintly as he opened the door. The smell of dust greeted him again, but beneath it, faint and sweet, there was something else, something like cinnamon lingering in the air. Max padded in beside him, nose twitching. Jack glanced at the stove, then at the counter where Maggie had fallen decades ago. The air above it felt charged, like the room itself was holding its breath. "All right, Maggie," he murmured. "Let's see what your stew tastes like." He unpacked a small bundle of groceries from the truck: potatoes, carrots, beef, a handful of herbs. He moved with quiet efficiency, the muscle memory of a man who'd cooked for survival more than pleasure. As he worked, he found himself talking under his breath the way he used to when his wife Sarah was still alive. She'd loved cooking. She'd said food could stitch people back together. He hadn't believed that until she died, and the house grew silent enough to hear grief breathe. He turned on the single working burner, dropped the beef into the pot, and let the smell bloom. The scent filled the diner, quickly warm and familiar. It was just stew, yet his hands trembled when he reached for the cinnamon. He hesitated, remembering Sarah's voice. "Just a pinch, Jack." Enough to remind them of home. He sprinkled it in. The fragrance hit him like a memory, detonating her kitchen, the sound of rain, the way she'd hum to the radio while stirring a pot of stew that smelled exactly like this. His throat closed. Max sat watching him, ears low, eyes soft, as if he too understood. Jack stepped back, breathing through the haze of steam. "This can't be," he whispered. But it was. It was her recipe. Or rather, it was Maggie's, but the same combination, the same rhythm of flavor passed down somehow across time. He reached for a bowl to serve it, but the cabinet doors resisted. The hinges shrieked when he pulled them open, revealing a jumble of chipped plates and tarnished cutlery. At the very back, half buried under a stack of broken mugs, sat a single enamel bowl cracked along one edge, its white surface dulled by decades of grime. Jack lifted it carefully. Along the rim, carved faintly into the metal, were the words, "For the ones who made it home." The inscription stopped him cold. The letters were uneven, hand-scratched, but deliberate. He traced them with his thumb, and the room seemed to draw still. He could almost see Maggie standing there carving those words after a long shift, maybe waiting for her husband to walk through the door. For the ones who made it home, he murmured aloud. That's what this place was. A homecoming. He turned the bowl over in his hands, and that's when he saw the smaller line etched below, so faint it almost vanished under the crack in the glaze. If I don't, Ed will. The message sent a tremor through him. It wasn't just a dedication, it was a promise. Maggie had written it for her husband, or maybe to him. Jack stared at the words until they blurred, feeling the air grow heavier around him. If I don't, Ed will. That meant the stew wasn't just food, it was a vow between them. One had sworn to keep feeding those who came back even if the other couldn't. He set the bowl down gently on the counter beside the open notebook, and for a long while he just stood there, the sound of the simmering pot filling the silence. The cinnamon mixed with the steam, carrying that same ghost of warmth through the diner. Max rose, walked over, and pressed his head against Jack's knee. Jack knelt, resting his hand on the dog's neck, the familiar weight grounding him. Maybe this wasn't just her recipe, he said softly. Maybe it's what she left behind for him. For both of them. Max huffed a short breath that sounded like agreement. Jack ladled the stew into the cracked bowl. The smell was nearly unbearable in its familiarity, rich, savory sweet around the edges. He took a small bite and the world seemed to tilt. It tasted exactly like Sarah's, down to the faint aftertaste of cinnamon that lingered on the tongue like a memory that refused to fade. His chest ached as he swallowed. How could two women 50 years apart make the same thing he whispered? The question hung unanswered. He looked again at the note scrawled beside the stew recipe for the boys who never came home. He thought of the soldiers who had sat here, of Maggie ladling stew for men whose eyes were still lost in war, of her husband haunted by ghosts he couldn't feed away. Maybe Sarah had found the same comfort in cooking that Maggie had. Maybe that's why the smell brought him back to her. The pot hissed as it cooled, and Jack stood over it, hands braced on the counter, breathing through the ache in his chest. The bowl, the recipe, the names, they all tied together in some way he couldn't yet see. He turned to Max, whose gaze hadn't moved from the floor near the counter, the same spot where the hollow sound had first come from. The dog gave a low rumble, a sound not of fear, but of attention, as though something below still mattered. Jack crouched, listening, hearing only the faint hum of the pipes and the whisper of wind outside. Still, the feeling didn't fade. He straightened, looked again at the bowl's inscription, and knew he was only at the edge of whatever story had been waiting all these years. The stew still steamed between them, carrying a scent that belonged to both the living and the gone. The following week, Jack kept the diner open just long enough to serve coffee to anyone curious enough to wander in. Most people passed by without stopping. Redfield wasn't the kind of town that believed in second chances, not for buildings and not for people. But that Friday morning, as the wind carried the scent of stew through the cracked door, an old man shuffled in. His coat was military issue, the kind that had outlived wars, and his cane clicked rhythmically against the floor. Max trotted to the doorway, sniffed once, then backed away as if recognizing something in the man's scent. Jack wiped his hands on a towel and approached. "Morning, sir," he said. "We're not exactly open, but the coffee's hot." The man's eyes lifted to the sign above the counter, Maggie's Place, and for a moment they filled with something between disbelief and grief. "So, it's true," he whispered. "The diner's alive again." He took a seat slowly at the same counter Maggie had once leaned over. "You must be her kin." Jack froze. "You knew Maggie Rourke?" The man gave a soft, broken laugh. "Knew her son. Every man in this county who made it home from Korea knew her. She fed us when no one else would." His hand trembled as he reached for the mug Jack poured. "I used to sit right here," he said quietly. "Right here, where she—" He stopped, his throat closing. Jack waited. The old man stared at the empty space in front of him, as if he could still see her moving behind the counter. "I came in that day," he continued, voice unsteady. "The day she died. There weren't many of us left then. Most of the boys had gone north for work. I was just passing through when I saw the lights on. She said she'd stay open as long as one of us still needed to eat." He set the cup down, eyes glistening. "But there was another man here first, young, maybe 30, still in uniform. Looked like he hadn't slept in a week. She called him Eddie. Jack's heart thudded once sharp. What happened? The man rubbed his temples. He was sitting right where you're standing now. Maggie was behind the counter talking to him soft. I couldn't hear every word, but I remember her saying, "You're home now, Ed. It's over." He said something back, something about his unit, about being the only one who made it back. Then he stood up sudden and pulled a revolver from his coat. Jack felt his pulse climb. The air in the diner seemed to tighten. The man's eyes drifted to the counter's edge. She didn't scream, he said, didn't even flinch. She just stepped forward and took his wrist, said, "Not in my diner, Ed. Not while I'm still breathing." He struggled, tried to pull away, but she held him, calling his name again and again. Then she gasped. Just one sound. He caught her as she fell. The doctor said her heart gave out from the strain. The old man swallowed hard. He stayed there for a minute, holding her, rocking like a child. Then he put the gun on the counter, kissed her forehead, and walked out into the night. Jack couldn't move. The details painted the picture too vividly. The woman from the photograph, the words, "For Ed," for coming home, the vow on the bowl, all of it made sudden, brutal sense. Maggie hadn't died alone. She died trying to save the man she loved. That soldier, Jack said quietly, "Did you ever see him again?" The man shook his head. "Not once. But I heard things. Some said he drove south, took odd jobs, lived under another name. Others said he joined a veterans hospital as a worker, trying to pay back what he thought he'd taken. Nobody ever found proof, but I remember his eyes. They were the kind of eyes that never stop apologizing." The diner fell silent except for the faint ticking of the ceiling fan. Jack glanced at Max, who lay pressed against the counter, head resting exactly where the man had pointed where Maggie had fallen. What was he like before that day, Jack asked. "Eddie." The man smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth trembling. He was quiet, good with people. Used to fix cars when he wasn't helping here. Maggie said he came home with a hole in his chest that medicine couldn't touch. She thought feeding others might fill it. He sighed. Guess she'd never realized she was his last reason to stay. Jack gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles pale. He felt the weight of generations settle on his shoulders, the same last name, the same restless blood, the same silence that followed tragedy. He blamed himself, Jack said. That's why he left. "Wouldn't you?" the man replied softly. "If the woman you loved died trying to stop you from dying," Jack didn't answer. The stew pot bubbled faintly behind them, its smell rising in slow, deliberate waves. The man turned eyes wet but calm. "You're doing right by her," he said, "by keeping this place open. Maybe that's what she wanted all along." He slid a folded dollar bill onto the counter and stood leaning heavily on his cane. "Keep the change," he said. "She never let me pay before." He turned toward the door, his reflection passing across the diner window. Jack wanted to stop him to ask if he remembered anything else, but the words wouldn't form. The man paused at the threshold, looking back once more. "You tell whoever you are," he said, "that Maggie Rourke didn't die of a broken heart. She died saving one." Then he was gone, leaving the door swinging softly behind him and the wind carrying the faint echo of his words into the quiet room. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. The stew pot still sat cooling on the stove, the faint smell of cinnamon and beef drifting through the diner like a ghost that refused to leave. The old veteran's story replayed in his head in broken fragments: the revolver, the struggle, the fall, the silence that followed. Maggie had died saving her husband, and her husband had vanished under the weight of it. Jack sat at the counter where it had all happened, a single lamp glowing above him, his fingers tracing the carved initials on the wooden edge, E+M. He whispered their names into the quiet. Edward and Maggie Rourke. The name Rourke stuck in his throat, his own last name. It wasn't coincidence anymore, it was blood. The next morning, he drove to the county records office, Max in the passenger seat, nose pressed to the cold glass. The clerk, a man in his 60s, looked at him curiously when Jack laid the request form on the desk. "You're looking for an Edward Rourke, born around 1925, the man asked, scanning the lines. "That's right," Jack said. The man disappeared into the back, leaving Jack to stare at the dust motes swirling in the light. When he returned, he carried a thin manila folder worn soft at the edges. "We've got an Edward A. Rourke," he said. "Served in the Army Korean War. Married a Margaret Hill in 1951. Widow, declared deceased in 1956. He flipped a page. "No remarriage on record, but there's a note here: transfer of residence to California in 1957. Listed occupation maintenance worker at a veterans hospital." Jack's chest tightened. "Do you have a death certificate?" The clerk nodded. "Died 1985. Riverside County, heart failure." Jack took the copy with unsteady hands. The signature at the bottom was faint but familiar, his father's handwriting. Edward Rourke, Jr. His father had signed as next of kin. Jack left in silence, the folded paper pressing like truth against his ribs. He parked by the diner and sat for a long time staring at the mountains, his breath fogging the windshield. His grandfather hadn't disappeared into myth or scandal. He had lived quietly, died quietly, and somewhere in between he had tried to atone. But if his father had known why, had he never said a word? That night, Jack sat at the diner's back booth with his laptop scrolling through online archives until he found it: Riverside County Veterans Home, 1985. There, among the sparse possessions listed for one, Edward A. Rourke, was a note. Personal effects include wristwatch Bible and one sealed postcard unsent. The record ended there. Jack's pulse quickened. He made a call to the home, now converted into a state-run facility, and after a patient conversation with an administrator, she promised to check the archives. 2 days later, a small package arrived. The paper yellowed, the handwriting shaky but unmistakably familiar, his own family's. Inside was the postcard, never sent edges, curled ink fading but legible. "To my grandson Jack. Someday cook or stew again. For both of us. Ed." Jack stared at it until the letters blurred. His grandfather had known him, or at least known he would exist. Somehow, he had carried that hope all the way to his final days. Jack pressed the card against his chest, and for the first time since Sarah's death, the tears came without warning. Max rested his head on Jack's thigh, silent and steady. "He knew me," Jack whispered. He waited for this. But beneath the warmth of the realization came something sharper. His father had kept this hidden. All those years of silence, all the bitterness in his voice, whenever Jack mentioned service or family, it wasn't just anger, it was inheritance. The pain had passed from father to son like a baton no one wanted to hold. Jack remembered his father's last argument before he died, the words echoing, "You don't know what leaving costs a man." Maybe his father wasn't talking about Jack's own departure from home after the Marines. Maybe he was talking about his own father, the man who had left Maggie and carried that guilt into the grave. Jack laid the postcard beside the old recipe notebook and stared at them both. 3 generations of Rourke men defined by leaving. Ed had left because he couldn't face what he'd done. Ed Jr. had left because he couldn't forgive. And Jack had left because he didn't know how to stay. The pattern stretched back like a scar running through the family line. He traced the faded ink again. Cook or stew again. For both of us, the message wasn't about food, it was about coming home. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the old diner sign in white. Jack turned off the lights and stood at the window watching it settle. Max pressed against his leg, his breath fogging the glass. "We're not running anymore," Jack said softly, "not this time." He picked up the postcard once more, studying the shaky letters that crossed the decades. The edges were fragile, but the words held firm. He slipped it into the recipe notebook right beside Maggie's handwriting and felt something click into place. For the first time in years, the past didn't feel like a weight, it felt like a map. The snow didn't stop that night. It piled along the window ledge of the diner, softening the corners of the old sign until Maggie's place looked like a whisper carved in white. Inside, Jack kept the stove running more for the warmth than the light. He had spent the past 2 nights reading and rereading his grandfather's postcard, tracing the faded letters until they felt etched into his skin. The diner no longer felt like someone else's ruin. It felt like something calling him back to finish what had been left undone. Max lay curled near the counter tail, twitching as he dreamed the kind of sleep that came only to dogs who trusted their world again. Jack smiled faintly, reached down to scratch behind his ear, and said softly, "You found her story, buddy. Guess it's our turn to write the rest." The next morning, Jack decided to clean the kitchen properly. He pulled down loose boards, scrubbed old grease from the counters, and hauled out boxes of rusted utensils. The work was slow but steady, each clang of metal or brush of dust another way to peel back the years. When he reached the back wall, Max began pawing at a section near the corner, nails clicking sharply. "What is it this time?" Jack muttered, moving closer. The wall there sounded hollow. He pressed against it and felt the faint give of old plaster. A few pries with a screwdriver and a panel came loose, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Max sneezed, tail wagging. Behind the wall was a narrow cavity no larger than a drawer, and inside hung a bundle of fabric. Jack pulled it free carefully. It was an apron, yellowed and stiff with age, embroidered with the name Maggie in small blue thread. The pocket bulged slightly. His hands shook as he reached inside and drew out a folded piece of paper. Edges, brittle words, faded but still legible. He smoothed it gently across the counter and began to read. "If you find this, Ed, please don't run. I know you. I know what's in your eyes when the night gets too quiet. You think leaving will save others from your hurt, but it only teaches them to carry it. Forgive yourself for all of it. For the ones who didn't come back and for what happened here. This diner is home, Ed. If you can't stay, maybe someone with your name will. Love doesn't end at waits." Jack sat down hard on the stool, the letter trembling in his hands. The ink had blurred in places smudged by water. Maybe tears, maybe the steam of the kitchen the night she wrote it. He could see her there, apron-tied pen scratching across the paper, while the stew simmered on the stove, knowing her husband might never hear her voice again. The last line stopped him cold. "If you can't stay, maybe someone with your name will." She had written that for him without knowing it. She had known Ed would run, known the guilt would be too heavy, but she'd left a bridge for whoever came after, for the blood that would return. He laid the letter flat beside the postcard, the words of two people separated by decades, but bound by the same regret, the same "please stop running." His chest ached, not just with sadness, but with something deeper understanding. Maggie hadn't just tried to save her husband, she'd tried to save everyone who would ever carry his shame. Max pressed his muzzle against Jack's arm, a low whine rumbling in his throat. Jack smiled faintly through the haze. "She was talking to me, wasn't she?" he whispered, "all this time." He stood walking to the stove and reached for the pot. The motion came without thought. Now oil onions, beef carrots, a pinch of cinnamon, the same way Sarah used to cook, the same way Maggie must have done. When the scent began to rise thick and warm, Jack felt something ease inside him as if the diner itself exhaled. He opened the window, letting the smell drift out into the snow-covered street. The stew simmered, filling the air with a peace he hadn't known in years. He thought about Ed somewhere far away in 1956, sitting in his truck with shaking hands and a heart too heavy to bear. He thought about Ed Jr., who'd grown up without knowing the truth, and about himself, the man who had inherited the silence of both. The letter in the apron felt like a hand on his shoulder guiding him toward a choice neither of them had managed to make, to stay and to forgive. When the stew was ready, Jack poured it into the cracked enamel bowl, the same one with Maggie's carved words, and set it on the counter. The steam curled upward like smoke from a candle newly lit. He whispered the lines aloud, voice steady now. "For the ones who made it home. If I don't, Ed will." He let the words settle, then added quietly, "And if he couldn't, I will." Outside, the snow had stopped. The world beyond the window was washed clean silver and still. Jack took a spoonful of the stew, tasting the warmth, the cinnamon, the quiet forgiveness that came with it. Max sat beside him, head tilted, tail thumping once against the floor, as if he knew they had reached a turning point, Not an ending, but a beginning that had been waiting 70 years. By the end of the week, the diner no longer looked abandoned. Jack had cleaned every inch of the counter, replaced the broken light above the window, and scrubbed the old sign until the faint letters beneath Maggie's place could finally breathe again. He painted over them, carefully adding 3 new words that came straight from the postcard still tucked in his pocket, Home Again Cafe. Underneath smaller letters read, Veterans Eat Free. It was a quiet morning when he hung the sign on the door. The sky was a pale silver, the kind that made the air taste like frost. Jack stood there for a long time, his breath fogging the glass, wondering if anyone would come. He didn't expect a line. He just wanted one person, someone who'd understand what the place was trying to say without words. Max paced by the window, tail low but wagging as if sensing that something important was beginning. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee and ladled the first batch of stew into the pot, the cinnamon scent wrapping the diner like a memory coming home. The bell over the door jingled softly. Jack turned half surprised and saw an old man standing just inside the doorway, hat in his hands. He looked around slowly, eyes tracing every surface, every chair like someone walking through a photograph. His coat was threadbare, his metals tarnished but still shining faintly in the light. "Morning," Jack said gently. "Come on in, sit anywhere you like." The man hesitated, then took a seat at the counter, the same stool Maggie's last customer had sat in all those years ago. Jack poured him a cup of coffee, then set a steaming bowl of stew in front of him without a word. The man nodded his thanks and began to eat slowly, his spoon trembling slightly as he lifted it. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint scrape of spoon against bowl and the low hum of the ceiling fan. Halfway through, the man set the spoon down and rubbed his eyes. His voice came out rough, as though unused to being heard. "You know," he said quietly, "I ate this once before, a long time ago, same smell, same taste. She used to make it every Friday." Jack didn't have to ask who he meant. The man stared into the bowl, his reflection rippling in the broth. "I came here the week after the war ended. Couldn't sleep, couldn't look anyone in the eye. She just kept feeding me, wouldn't take a cent. Said the first meal home should never cost a man anything." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both warmth and pain. "That stew, it saved me. Reminded me that the world still had room for kindness." Jack swallowed the tightness in his throat. "You knew her?" "Knew her," the man said softly. "We all did. She had a list behind the counter names of soldiers who hadn't made it back yet. Every week, she'd pick one and say, 'This bowl's for him.' Then she'd serve the rest of us, and we'd all feel like maybe we were still carrying someone's memory home." He looked up, then his eyes glassy. "She said if anyone ever came back to this diner, even decades later, they should eat the first bowl like they never left." The words settled in the air like a benediction. Jack felt something crack open inside him, quiet and deep. He nodded once, unable to speak. The man reached for his spoon again, took one last bite, and set it down carefully. A tear slid down his cheek, catching in the wrinkles carved by years of silence. "You're doing right by her," he said. "You brought her home again." Jack gripped the counter, his knuckles white, trying to keep his composure. "I just followed her recipe," he said softly. The man smiled, standing slowly to pat Jack's shoulder. "She always said the same thing. But it wasn't just the recipe, son. It was what she put in it. The only thing stronger than war," he paused, voice cracking, "is kindness." The bell jingled again as he left the door, closing softly behind him. Jack stood there for a long while, staring at the empty stool, the half-finished bowl of stew, the faint steam curling upward like a prayer. Max padded over, resting his head on Jack's knee, eyes searching his face. Jack sank down beside him, pressing a hand to the dog's fur. "You hear that, buddy?" he whispered. "Kindness." For the first time in years, his voice didn't break when he said it. He looked around the diner, the light streaming through the windows, the scent of cinnamon still floating in the air, and realized it didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt alive. That afternoon, more people stopped by. A young man in a faded marine jacket. A woman with silver hair who said her husband had eaten here once. They didn't come for the food, not really. They came for what the place remembered. Jack served each one without hurry, listening to their stories, their laughter, their pauses. And each time he filled a bowl, he whispered the same thing under his breath: "Welcome home." Max stayed by the door tail, thumping every time someone entered, as if greeting each soul who'd finally found their way back. The diner echoed again, with quiet conversation, the sound of spoons tapping against enamel, and the kind of laughter that trembles before it heals. The diner had grown busier in the weeks since the sign went up, but it wasn't noise that filled the place. It was warmth. Laughter that came slow at first, like limbs learning to move again. The smell of cinnamon and beef became its heartbeat, and each night when Jack locked the door, he could almost feel Maggie's presence in the soft glow of the lights that refused to die. He thought often about the postcard, the letter, the men who had sat here trembling between life and memory. But he didn't expect the next visitor to carry the final piece of their story. It was late afternoon when she arrived, the kind of golden hour that stretched long shadows across the floor. She was in her 60s hair, silver posture, steady, dressed neatly in a gray wool coat. She stood just inside the doorway for a moment, eyes sweeping the room as if matching it against a memory. Jack wiped his hands on a towel and approached Max, trotting quietly at his side. "Afternoon, ma'am. Welcome to Home Again Cafe," he said with a kind smile. She looked at him for a long beat before answering, her voice soft but sure. "You must be Jack Rourke." The sound of his own name caught him off guard. "Yes, ma'am," he said slowly. "Do I know you?" "No," she said. And then with a small smile, "But my father did." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. Its corners creased, its black and white image faded almost to sepia. She laid it gently on the counter. In it, a young woman stood beside Maggie Rourke, both wearing aprons, the diner's old sign visible in the background. The woman's smile was radiant, the kind that could cut through grief. "That's my mother," she said softly, "and that's Maggie. This was printed in 1958, 2 years after Maggie died. My father had the picture made from an old negative they found in her camera." Jack blinked, confused. "Your father?" He knew her, the woman nodded. "My father was one of the soldiers she saved. He was there the night she died. When Ed left his ring on the counter, my father picked it up and kept it safe until it could be returned." Her eyes glistened with the weight of decades. "He never forgot her. He told me she didn't die because of war or fate. She died because she refused to let another man die when she could stop it." Jack felt his chest tighten. He had imagined that moment so many times, Maggie's hands reaching for Ed's wrist, the struggle, the sudden stillness, but hearing it from the daughter of the man she'd saved gave it shape, flesh meaning. The woman continued, her voice trembling slightly. "My father lived another 50 years. He said every day after that felt like a borrowed gift. He spent his life helping other veterans, started a shelter in Maggie's name. When he passed, he asked me to find this place. Said if I ever found someone keeping her legacy alive, I should give them this." She opened her palm. Inside lay a simple gold wedding ring, dulled by time but unmistakably precious. Jack stared at it, heart thundering. Inside the band, faint but legible, were 2 letters engraved in looping script, E and M. He touched it reverently, thumb tracing the worn metal. "Where did he get this?" he asked. My father said Maggie's husband left it on the counter the night she died," she said. "He picked it up when they carried her away. He never told anyone, not even my mother, until near the end. He said it wasn't his to keep, it was his to return." Jack's voice was barely a whisper. "Then it's home again." The woman smiled through her tears. He would have liked to see this place. He said she used to hum while she cooked, like she was singing the world back together. Jack swallowed hard, words failing him. He reached for the small box behind the counter, the one that held the old recipe notebook, the postcard, and Maggie's letter. He placed the ring beside them carefully. For a moment, he just looked at the 3 objects lying together, the circle complete. Max, who had been sitting quietly near the floor, rose and moved closer. Without command, he circled the counter once, then lay down right at the base of it, resting his head on his paws, eyes half closed. The same spot Jack realized where Maggie had fallen 70 years ago. It was as if the dog had felt something release a quiet settling of unfinished stories. The diner grew silent, peaceful, full like breath after prayer. The woman watched Max, her eyes soft. "Animals always know," she said quietly. "They feel peace before we do." Jack nodded, voice thick. "He's been guarding that spot since the day I found the recipe," he said. Maybe he was waiting for her to rest. The woman reached out and squeezed his hand. "Then maybe you've both done what you were meant to do," she said. You gave her story an ending. Jack glanced at the counter, the stew pot still simmering behind him, the faint scent of cinnamon rising again. "Not an ending," he said after a pause. "Just home." Max shifted slightly, pressing his nose against the floor, as if acknowledging something unseen. Jack watched him, his eyes burning, and then looked back at the ring glinting in the afternoon light. The engraved letters caught the Sun E and M, 2 lives bound by love loss, and the stubborn grace of forgiveness. He thought of the line Maggie had written, "If you can't stay, maybe someone with your name will." He hadn't understood then that forgiveness could pass down through blood, waiting for someone willing to claim it. Now, standing in the golden light of the diner surrounded by the warmth of her memory, he finally did. A year later, the diner no longer looked like a place the world had forgotten. The windows gleamed under the morning sun, the smell of coffee and stew drifted through the open door, and laughter carried through the space like music. The sign out front, painted in bold red letters, "Home Again Cafe," had become a small landmark in town. Beneath it, the words "Veterans Eat Free" were now so well known that people joked they could find the place blindfolded just by following the smell of cinnamon. Inside, Jack moved behind the counter with the ease of a man who had finally found his rhythm again. His hair had turned more silver over the past year, but his eyes had softened. There was peace in the way he stirred the stew, a kind of gratitude in every motion. Max, now slower and heavier around the muzzle, still insisted on sitting by the front door, tail sweeping lazily across the floor each time someone entered. The regulars would stop to pat his head before taking their seats, calling him the keeper of home. The diner filled with familiar faces, men and women who carried their stories, quietly families who came to sit in the booths where their fathers once ate. On the far wall hung framed photos, black and white portraits of Maggie, Ed, and others who had served and returned. Below them, a small brass plaque gleamed softly in the morning light. It read, "For Maggie and Ed, who fed the hungry and healed the broken." Jack had installed it himself one quiet evening after closing with Max watching from the floor, as if keeping vigil. Every time he passed it, he felt something loosen in his chest, as though those words had finally released the ghosts that lingered. Some days, people would ask about the recipe. Jack would smile, shake his head, and say, "It's not in the stew, it's in the remembering." Then he'd ladle another bowl, the scent of cinnamon rising with the steam. He'd watch the faces of those who took the first bite, the way their shoulders relaxed, their eyes softened, and he knew they felt it too. The taste of coming home. That spring, Jack decided to write a letter. Not to the past, but to the future. He sat at the same counter where Maggie had once stood, the same counter where his grandfather had nearly ended everything, and began to write on a page torn from the back of her old recipe book. To my son, he began his handwriting slow but steady. "If you ever find this, know that forgiveness tastes like stew and cinnamon. Life won't always make sense, but don't run from it. The only way to heal is to stay. This diner is proof of that. Feed people when you can listen more than you speak, and remember that home isn't a place, it's a promise you keep." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the same tin box where Maggie's recipe had once been hidden. Then, with a small smile, he crouched behind the counter, lifted a loose floorboard, and slid the box beneath it. He guided the box down to the shallow metal recess he'd glimpsed weeks earlier, feeling it settle flush against the joist. Max watched him from nearby, head-tilted eyes full of that same knowing patience he had always carried. Jack rubbed the dog's ear. "Your turn to guard another secret." Max huffed softly. Evening came quietly, the sun stretching gold across the windows, the air outside humming with the faint sound of passing cars and distant laughter. The last customers left, leaving half-empty mugs and the lingering warmth of conversation behind. Jack wiped the counter, turned off the lights one by one, and sat down beside Max near the front door. The dog rested his head on Jack's knee, eyes half closed the way he always did when the world felt safe. Jack looked around the diner, the brass plaque catching the last light. The photos on the wall, the bowl on the shelf carved with the words, "For the ones who made it home." His voice was barely above a whisper when he said, "We finally came home, buddy." Outside, the sunset deepened into a soft amber glow washing through the glass and touching every surface with warmth. The pot of stew simmered quietly on the stove, steam curling upward in slow, graceful ribbons that shimmered in the light. It rose toward the ceiling, twisting gently like smoke from a candle before disappearing into the air. For a long time, Jack sat there watching it fade, feeling something he hadn't known in years, a peace that didn't demand understanding. There were no more mysteries left to chase, no more ghosts to feed. The past had found its place not buried or forgotten, but woven into the scent of cinnamon that would linger here long after he and Max were gone. Each day, new hands would stir the pot, new stories would fill the air, and the same words would greet every soul who walked through the door, "Welcome home." Max shifted closer, letting out a small sigh, and Jack rested his hand on the dog's back. They sat together as the light faded, silence speaking louder than words. Outside, the world kept moving, but inside Home Again, cafe time seemed to hold its breath, a moment caught between memory and grace. And when the last trace of sunlight slipped below the hills, the diner stood glowing against the twilight, not as a monument to loss, but as proof that love, when tended, could outlast everything. If this story moved, you don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Which moment hit you the hardest? Maggie's letter, the ring, or Jack's final words to Max? Tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know who's joining us at the Home Again Cafe.